Our next presenter will be Crystal Watkins. Ms. Watkins is a team leader for the Public Water Supply team in the Dallas-Fort Worth region office in the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Master's of Science in Wildlife and Fisheries Science from Texas A&M University. Crystal has worked for TCEQ since 2012 as an environmental investigator and now in a management role. Her duties include conducting drinking water investigations, managing a team of environmental investigators, and helping with interpretation of rules and regulations. Without further ado, please welcome Crystal Watkins.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to be talking about how to prepare for a groundwater investigation. My goal for you today is after you see this presentation, you're less terrified when a TCEQ investigator calls you to schedule a CCI, and you're going to get a glowing general compliance letter because you took my tips and tricks here. So we're going to kind of talk about what is the comprehensive compliance investigation, which is the routine investigations that we tend to do, what to expect before, during, and after your investigation, some common violations we see on the paperwork side, as well as the facility side, and then some tools for your operator toolbox. So why do we have to have these investigations? Well, the EPA or TCEQ has primacy in Texas, and so in order to maintain that primacy, they have to fulfill the sanitary survey requirement. And for Texas, our sanitary survey is called a comprehensive compliance investigation. And this is an on-site review of your water source, your facility operations and maintenance, as well as your records. For the EPA, if you're a community water system, we are required to inspect you every 3 years. If you are a non-community system, we come and conduct an inspection every 5 years. And so us conducting these investigations are critical in ensuring that we are protecting human health and the environment and making sure that we're ensuring the safety of drinking water for all of our constituents. So what to expect? What typically happens is your regional investigator will contact your PWS contact, and this could be either your contact in Drinking Water Watch or whoever was the person that was our contact from the last CCI, and we will schedule the investigation typically within the next 14 days. This is a very small kind of font or image of it, but we typically will send you a list of TCEQ records. That list of records is all encompassing of all records, so you may have some records on there that do not apply to you, but in general, you'll send a list of records, we'll schedule the investigation, and you will get a confirmation email that will confirm the date, time, and location of the investigation. So, what can you do to prepare for your CCI? What you want to do is make sure you gather your records and do a brief review. On our TCEQ website, one of our resources that we have is a generalized checklist that some of the investigators will use. You can download that checklist and do a kind of mini audit yourself before then. And if you do find any issues, go ahead and correct it before we come out. You want to make sure you want to make sure you do an overview of your facilities. Do you have anything leaking? Are your vent screens on your wells? And make sure you check the chlorine. You want to make sure, you don't want to get there on the day and realize that your chlorinator broke and now you don't have any chlorine in your distribution system. So what to expect? You can have an entrance meeting. So this is just kind of to confirm things like your connection count, population, who is the responsible party. We'll look through your records, and then we'll typically go on site and look at your facilities, your wells, if you have them, your ground storage tanks, disinfectant, and then we'll also do a distribution system monitoring, and we'll monitor for pressure, and we'll monitor for disinfectant residual. At the end, we'll do an exit interview, and the exit interview is nothing really formal. Sometimes it's on the back of the tailgate where we will note the violations that we noted, or it could be something a little bit more formal depending on what you would prefer. During the, like I said, entrance meeting, we're going to outline our objectives, arrange for personnel to accompany the investigator. If your system is a fairly large system, you might have simultaneous field operations going on, teams where you'll have one team going to one side of the city or distribution system, and you will have another team going out just to make sure that we're more efficient and we're not taking up too much of your time. And then if you have any PPE or safety policies, we'll go through that, and then we'll identify everybody who's present. So one thing I do want to highlight is, and this is something we get a lot, is what is a connection? So a connection is a single-family residential unit or commercial establishment to which drinking water is supplied from the system. So if you serve nothing but homes or mobile homes, 1 meter is going to equal 1 connection. So if you're a small homeowners association, you have 35 homes in your neighborhood, your connection count is 35. Now, it's going to change when you have what we called equivalent living units. So an apartment complex is exactly an example of one. An apartment complex could have 1 meter for the entire complex, but within that apartment complex, that could be 200 or more connections. So when we're coming out and getting your connection count, we would say that you would have 1 meter and 200 connections or 7 connections, however many units is in that apartment complex. So that's something you want to keep in mind. The things, apartment complexes, mobile home parks, RV parks, if you have a commercial meter for some of those facilities, you're going to want to make sure that before you have your inspection, that you're identifying how many units are in each one of those so you can provide that to the investigator. Here is a list of records that we're going to ask for. Operator information, monthly operating reports, BPATs. And so with monthly operating reports, for surface water systems, we require that all this information is collected in general into one document. That is not a requirement for groundwater or purchased water systems. However, we do find that a lot of them like to keep their disinfectant residual monitoring records, the volume of water treated, as well as their chemical usage records, all in one document. So for our rules, if you are more than 250 connections, you have to collect information for disinfectant residuals, amount of chemical use, and your volume of water treated daily. And daily means 7 days a week, so even on the weekends. So if you serve more than 250 connections, you have to get that information every day. If you serve less than 250 connections, for the volume of water treated and amount of chemical used, you have to collect that information weekly. And the disinfectant residual, you have to collect that once every 7 days. And note that I want to tell you that the definition of weekly and every 7 days is different. So, for your amount of volume of water treated, you can monitor on Sunday, and then next week, you can monitor on a Wednesday. You have done the once a week monitoring, but that would not qualify for every 7 days of monitoring for your disinfectant residual. So I don't want y'all to get tripped up during your investigation with something like that. In general, what we find is that most systems will just do everything every 7 days to make sure they're complying with the rule. The common mistakes we see for this type of monthly operating report is only recording once a month or less than what the frequency says. So once again, less than 250 connections, you're either having to record information weekly or every 7 days. And if you have more than 250 connections, you have to monitor every day. Another thing you want to be careful of is when you're doing your chemical usage, we have people that will record how many bottles of disinfectant they're putting into their reservoir. And that's not the same as how much chemicals you're using. That is how many bottles you're using to replenish your supply, but the amount of chemical you're using is going to be different than that. So in that case, if you don't have anything like that, an easy way to monitor that, we see a lot of people use scales. If you're if your supplier has clear 55-gallon barrels, we have seen people mark on the side a ruler, and then they can convert 1 inch equals 1 gallon. So you know if it moves down 1 inch, you have had 1 gallon. That's not the exact ratio, but that might be something to talk to your vendor if you don't have an easy way to monitor how much chemical you use. Once again, monitoring the disinfectant residual once per week versus every 7 days. So you want to make sure that you're keeping track with that once every 7 days so you can avoid potentially getting a violation. Another thing that we see is people not recording the location of the disinfectant residual. So as part of our investigation, we have to ensure that your bacteriological samples and your disinfectant residuals are representative of your distribution system. And so one way we will do that is look at your monitoring plan, look at your distribution map, and then also look at your daily disinfectant residual records at the same time to make sure it's representative. If you don't have those locations listed on your disinfectant residual records, we can't confirm that your samples are collected that are representative. So you want to make sure you put a location, or if you have your monitoring plan and you have your sites listed 1 through 6, you can put on your monitoring plan site 1, site 2, site 6 versus having to put the exact address. Tank inspection forms. So all tanks, elevated, ground storage, and pressure tanks have to be inspected annually. If you have a pressure tank that has an inspection port, you want to make sure that you're inspecting it in interior once every 5 years. Each tank has to have its own separate tank inspection form. So if you have two ground storage tanks and 2 pressure tanks, we should see 4 tank inspection forms during our investigation. Now, I know a lot of people think that with tank inspections, they have to have a contracted company to inspect them, and that's absolutely false. The rule says that water personnel can conduct inspections of those facilities, so if you don't want to pay an outside vendor to come inspect your tank, you can absolutely do it yourself. This is some pictures, and these are actually real life in pictures. Yes, that's a dead bird in the tank. That was a lovely surprise at 10 a.m. in the morning when I was doing that inspection. When we're doing our inspections, we are looking for deficiencies like this. Do you have foreign objects in your ground storage tanks? Is your tanks in good condition? Are you missing vent screens or locks on some of your of your facility? So this is why it would be really good to do a pre-investigation so you can catch some of these mistakes and fix them before we come out. Here are the inspection forms. A copy of this inspection form, I believe, is also on the TCQ website. It is totally fine to use that as part of your tank inspections. Once again, some common mistakes we see: 1 tank, 1 form, not having 1 tank for each 1 form. So just make sure that fortunately, if you have a lot of tanks, you're going to have a lot of pieces of paper you're going to keep up with. But that allows us to ensure that each of your tanks in your facilities have been inspected. You want to make sure you're identifying the tanks. So if you have 2 tanks that are the same size, you want to make sure you kind of note which one is which: east side, west side, north, south, green, blue, etc. And the big one we see is not inspecting a pressure tank with an inspection port once every 5 years. So if you have a big enough tank, you'll have an inspection port, and you're going to want to make sure that's inspected every 5 years. And make sure you have that document ready, because your investigator is going to ask, when's the last time you inspected the interior? You can have that ready to hand to them, and you're going to be compliant. Flushing logs. So your dead end mains have to be flushed on monthly intervals, and you have to record the dates that your dead ends are being flushed. And so these records have to be kept for 2 years. And one of the biggest things we see is people not recording when they're flushing. You want to make sure that you're recording that you're flushing so that you can ensure that so we can ensure that you are maintaining water quality. If you're new, dead end mains are portions of your distribution system in which stagnant water can collect. And if you have something like a drop in pressure, you can have stagnant, nasty water potentially back siphon into your system. So you want to make sure that you're flushing this on a monthly basis. And another thing is people are not recording the dates that they are flushing the dead end mains. So you can see in this bottom example that says date flush dead end, it just says water loss. So this was a violation because they have not indicated when they have flushed their dead end mains. The plant operations manual, every water system has to have one, even small ones. And I will let you know that there is that Senate Bill 3 package that Michelle Risco was talking about the first day. The weather resilience package includes a big change into the your plant operations manual. So the rules are going to include information on what is your critical components and how are you going to protect them from weather. So just to kind of give you that heads up that the SOP, your plant operations manual or your SOP might be getting a little bit bigger. You want to make sure you're retaining this for the life of the PWS, and you want to make sure you have routine and repair procedures, as well as protocols if there is some kind of man-made or natural disaster. And you want to make sure there's contact information for important people in association with the water system. So your board president, the main operator, your chemical vendor, so that if someone needs to be contacted in association with the water system, they can do that. We have an excellent regulatory guidance called Managing a Small Public Water System Operations and Maintenance. This guidance document will pretty much walk you through to creating a SOP that is compliant with the rule. They'll have spaces where you can handwrite information, and then when you're ready for your inspection, you can hand this packet to your investigator to show how you're compliant. We've also had people create ones themselves that shows the daily requirements, monthly, quarterly, annually, and then usually on the back we see emergency personnel information. The biggest number one violation we tend to see is not including your contact information. So there's some good contacts you want to keep in is, like I said, your chemical vendors, your board president, an operator, especially with what happened a couple years ago. You want to see if you have an electric provider contact information. You can also put your local regional contact. I recommend not putting a specific investigator's phone number on there, but the main line, just because you want to make sure if there's something going on, it's getting routed immediately versus being stuck in someone's voicemail. Another thing we also see is not providing enough detail. You want to make sure you're talking about your routine maintenance activities. So once a month, you take bacteriological samples. Every day, you're taking chlorine residuals. Every year, you are checking for backflow and doing your tank inspection forms. And finally, another one that we see is not being updated. So you've added a new well, or maybe you've changed for free chlorine to chloramines. You want to make sure that if you're making any changes to your system, that you are updating your plant operations manual to reflect those changes. Backflow. So if you're a very small community water system that, is only serving residential connections, you may not have to worry about backflow as much, but it's something that you still should be aware of. So preventing backflow is an essential part of your cross-connection control program. So your cross-connection control program consists of your customer service inspections, your backflow, and then making sure you have customer service agreements or a plumbing ordinance that prevents that prohibits certain activities like mixing wastewater and drinking water lines. Backflow devices have to be tested by a backflow prevention assembly tester, and the most common cross-connection we see is due to a garden hose. So you see a garden hose that's constantly connected to a hose bib. It could be sitting into a puddle of water. It could be sitting in a swimming pool. We have heard situations where there have been backflows of little ponds or lakes due to a common cross connection like this. So, and once again, backflow is undesirable reversal of the flow of water, and you're mixing water that is considered undesirable. So this is not just hazardous chemicals that everybody thinks of. Coffee, it could be an undesirable substance in your water, especially for those who are on medications, what makes them more sensitive to caffeine. We have a list, 29047F, in the back of our rules that has a list of all of our backflow assemblies or types of facilities that would need a backflow assembly. One thing I do want to mention is if you serve a splash pad or interactive water fountain, that absolutely needs to have a backflow device, and it should have a reduced RPZ or reduced pressure principal backflow device. Common mistakes we see is you're using an outdated form. The form has been updated in 2019 and is updated on our TCEQ website, so you want to make sure that you're using that most recent form. Using a form that's deviated from the regular form. If you're going to do a form that's different, you want to make sure that you are getting approval from TCEQ. Your backflow testers has a test gauge that has to be calibrated every year. So you want to make sure that your backflow tester is making sure that their gauges are calibrated. If the gauges are not calibrated, then that backflow test is invalid and it has to be done again. And finally, you as the water system are the ones who should be keeping the original form, not your customers. Well calibration. So if you have a well, you are required to calibrate your wells once every 3 years. So you want to make sure that you're keeping the calibration tag. So when you buy a new well meter, there typically will have a tag that comes with it. Or you can have a company come out and conduct a well calibration. From what I'm hearing from some of the operators, it's almost cheaper just to buy a new meter versus calibrating it, and that's fine as well. Just make sure you're keeping that receipt of when you bought that well meter, so that will serve as your calibration record. We've gone through the records. You did great because you listened to my presentation, you took notes, and now you're going out in the field. So we're going to look at every part of your system, starting from production and when it's out into distribution. Another part of this that we're going to look at is capacity. We're going to make sure that based on what type of system you have, your facilities are big enough to meet those requirements. Some of the common violations we see is a sanitary control easement, and that blue bucket, and this is a true picture I took. Sorry, that was loud. That blue barrel is a well. And if you can't tell, that's a cow. And when I saw it, there was cow manure all around the well. So the rule says you have to keep animals away from that well within at least 150 feet. It's 50 feet at least from the animals. So you want to make sure that you have a sanitary control easement that is prohibiting restricted activities from the well. Another common violation that we see for wells is you have cracks or you have cracks in your wellhead, or your gooseneck vent for your well is missing the screen. So you want to make sure that when you are going through and doing your pre-investigation, you're checking the well vents, you're checking to make sure that there's no entries into your aquifer via your well. Disinfectant. One thing we see is that people will disinfect their water after storage. The rule says that all groundwater must be disinfected before storage. So you want to make sure and verify your points of application. You want to make sure that your facilities are housed in a way that is protected from weather. So this blue barrel on the right, at the bottom right, that is the disinfectant barrel, and it's out open into the elements. So if it rains or something happens, this barrel can be impacted or contaminated in a way. Water storage. You want to make sure that any facilities you have for your pressure tank, ground storage, and your elevated storage tanks meets AWWA standards. The black poly tanks that you see sometimes at Home Depot or other supply stores like that are not AWWA approved. So if you want to use a black poly tank like that, you're going to need to get an exception through our technical review and oversight team. I will let you know if you're going to use a poly tank and you want a big chance or higher chance of it getting approved, make sure it's black. If you have a white poly tank, we have seen algae grown in a white poly tank. They will not approve it if it's not housed inside. So save yourself some grief. If you're going to do a poly tank and get an exception for it, just get a black one. We also will go out in distribution. We'll make sure that you don't have drinking water lines crossing a creek without being encased in a proper concrete pipe. We'll also look at your service pumps, and this picture on the right, we typically are not gonna dig up your lines to see if they're 24 inches below grade, but this is a pretty good example of a pipe. I think this was not 24 inches. So we're not digging up your lines to make sure your pipes are below ground, but it's just something to keep in mind. We also will look at the general maintenance of your facility. Do you have a lot of debris or grass growing around your facilities in which rodents and other vectors of disease can be hiding in? Are you taking care of your tanks? Do you have so much rusting? And that, just to let you know, that screw is not supposed to be in there. That was the water system's way of preventing a leak. So that is not very smart to do, so don't do that. But we're making sure you have the general maintenance of your system is in good working condition. I believe in the picture of the right, we found a very large snake skin there because the people were not taking care of their facility. So if you are terrified of snakes like me, just make sure everything you have is free of any debris and cleaned up. Some other violations that we might find is if we find rusting, heavy rusting around your facilities means that there's a breaking down of that material and you could be compromising the safety of the water, so we might note a violation for that. Your fences. So your fences have to be at least 6 feet tall with 3 strands of barbed wire pointing in an outward direction. So do y'all think this fence on the left leaning almost halfway is compliant? You know, the big thing here is your fence needs to prevent intruder resistance. So if your barbed wire is compromised or if your fence is leaning so far over that someone can just step over it, you no longer have an intruder resistant fence and you could be exposing your water system to some unwanted visitors of the humankind. Another one is making sure that all your facilities are free of, are in a watertight condition. So on the tank on the right, we can see that there is rust kind of spots down the side of the ground storage tank. That could be an indication to us that you have a leak from your ground storage tank, and it can be another source of contamination into your system. So if you're finding that, make sure that you're addressing it beforehand, or if you find it and you don't have time to address it, make sure you do have a plan ready to talk to the investigator about. When you're going out in distribution, we're going to check your disinfectant residual. So if you use chlorine only, your minimum requirement is a 0.2. If you use what is called total chlorine or chloramines, the mixture of chlorine and ammonia, you are required to have 0.5. And we'll also measure your pressure out in distribution. 35 PSI is your normal, the minimum requirement under normal operating conditions. And this is at all portions of your distribution system. So your investigator might ask you to take you to the furthest point in your distribution system. So you want to make sure that furthest point has at least that minimal residual and has that pressure. So you've done the records, you've done the distribution, you've done looking at the facilities. Afterwards, you're going to get an exit interview form. So during the exit interview form, or exit interview, your investigator will talk to you about any problems they noted, and will let you know that they're going to note them as a violation. You'll get an exit interview form either via email or in person. And an AV is noted as an alleged violation, so these are things that we noted are wrong. We have PV, which is a potential violation, which means we may have to do some research to determine if it actually is a violation. And then we have something called an RR, which is a record request. So if there's records missing at your investigation, your investigators may not necessarily write you a violation immediately. They may ask you to just provide the records, typically within at least 7 to 14 days after you get your exit interview form. After your CCI, you're going to get a letter from your regional office, and if you have no violations, you're just going to get a letter. The letter says there was no violations, you put it in the file, we'll see you in 3 years. But if you do have something, we'll send you something with the letter called a summary of investigation findings. And that will be sent to your responsible official. So if you're part of a city and you have a mayor and your mayor likes to hold on to the paperwork, what you might want to do is let your investigator know and ask if they can CC you on the letter. So we can CC other individuals like the operators or the board president or whatnot on letters. So not only will a copy go to the mayor, but the copy will actually go to you. Because if we're giving you a 30-day time frame and your mayor isn't sending you the letter until 45 days after, you have already missed a deadline. So make sure to let your investigator know if you want a copy sent personally to you that you want to be CC'd on the letter. And then the compliance due dates begin at the start of the notice of violation unless it's specified in the exit interview form. And I'll let you know the only violation that we have a compliance due date that I know of that starts from the exit interview form is chlorine residual. So if you have low chlorine residual, you have 24 hours from when we notify you of having low chlorine for you to fix it and get it back up and running. I want to talk to you about some updated forms. The customer service inspection form was updated in 2017. As I mentioned before, the backflow prevention and maintenance test form was updated in 2019. The RTCR sample siting plan, there is a fillable document that you can use to create the sample siting plan. So those are the ones that I believe are the most updated. If you're a community water system, this compliance notebook is going to be so handy for you. If you type in compliance notebook on the TCQ website, and I know our website is kind of terrible, you can type in compliance notebook TCQ in Google and it should take you directly here. This will give you a lot of information I told you, and it will break down some of the stuff a little bit further so you can be prepared for your investigation. Another one I want to point out, there is a fillable monitoring plan template. So if you download the monitoring plan template and you fill it out with the information, that meets all the requirements that is in 290-121 for the monitoring plan. Additional resources, our TCQ website, there's a section under small business and local government assistance water compliance resources that will give you a lot of the guidance documents that are applicable to PWS. A lot of those guidance documents are in the TA booth, so if you haven't gone over there, you can go over and check that information out. Also wanted to give you some resources to some very helpful people. Small business and local government assistance is a really great assistance program. They will come out and help you. They are not going to necessarily write violations, and we typically will, if we send someone out to small business, they typically will handle helping out with violations or issues. But then they're not necessarily going to come back to us and say, well, this person didn't have a monitoring plan, write them a violation. So it's a really good resource along with FMT. FMT is a free resource to y'all. They do everything from helping on-site assessments to capacity to helping you create documents. We have the Environmentor program, so if you need a mentor in different aspects, you can get a Environmentor, and I promise you TCQ doesn't bite. So your regional office, a regional office in your water supply division is going to be a really great resource. This number right here, 512-239-4691, is the direct line to water supply division. Let people, when you reach that person, let them know what questions you have, and they can direct you to the right person. And with that, I am available to answer any questions.
A couple of questions. One concerning the effects of heat on the degradation of chlorine. Would you happen to?
So are you asking of what could happen with with heat in the chlorinator?
Well, the degradation of the purity of the chlorine.
Gotcha. Yes, so he's asking, it is known that sometimes that if you use a 55-gallon barrel over time, your chemical will degrade in strength. So it could have been a 12%, but then as time and heat goes, it can get less, and so you might have to use more. If you are a smaller water system in which a 55-gallon drum is way too much, you may want to ask your supplier about getting potentially a smaller amount. I think I've seen 35 gallons, and even some people are using 1 gallon for a very, very small system.
Well, the reason I ask is because we're a really small corporation system, we only have 45 connections. But I learned it the hard way because during the summertime last year when I first came on board, temperatures for the summer, and I caught myself having to increase the injection rates during the summer, right? And it wouldn't do anything. It would just, it continued going down until we got a new load. And initially, I poured that new load in the container, the injection drum, and all of a sudden,
It spiked up.
It's going up, and here I am cutting it back. And I didn't know what was going on until I did some research, and I found out that the effects, especially temperatures over 100 degrees, which are pretty common. Now, in the location that we're keeping those boxes of 6 gallons of was not insulated, and it was getting warm. So I found out the hard way, just FYI for everybody, that because once it's degraded, I mean, you know, you're going one way, it's down, and when you get a new batch, you're going to have to cut it back because it's too much.
And that's something, thanks for bringing it up. That is a good point. When you are filling in a new batch of disinfectant or chlorine, you know, you might want to turn down your injection rate a little bit, let it pump for a while, and then go monitor out in distribution, because you don't want, you know, if you're sending out a 9, you're going to hear from your customers. And so, but especially in the summer, you know, if you're not changed, you have to crank it up.
And especially the location where you're storing your chlorine at.
It might be better to, if you have an office, might be better to hold your chlorine at the office versus in the blazing hot disinfectant room.
Second question is concerning the calibrating of the well meter. Right? As you mentioned, you know, we're out in the country and being locating and contacting people that do zero and calibrating of any meters is coming in from San Antonio or anywhere in the bigger communities. So we went ahead, like you suggested earlier, we went ahead and purchased a new one, a replacement in kind. It was pretty expensive, you know. But either way, what I thought about doing was the fact that we gathered the number of gallons per minute on the one that we were going to replace. So it was 74 gallons a minute before we pulled it. Right, we installed the new one, and the new one was pumping 74 gallons a minute. So that to me would say, hey, it is still good. I mean, right? I mean,
right. So we know that in some places it can be hard to find a calibration service and expensive. We sometimes recommend what is called the bucket test. So, you know, you get a 5-gallon bucket, and if you can show that, hey, I did the test and I filled a 5-gallon bucket and our well calibration meter said 5 gallons, then we can potentially use that as your calibration for the well meter.
And the test was, I mean, that new meter was pumping exactly the same as the one that we replaced.
Right.
I'll ask one from online as you move over to get them. Do I have to take residuals when I flush? I was told that I have to do that, a residual when I first start and after I let it flush at least 5 minutes.
No. So if you look at the rules for flushing, the rule says the dates of dead end mains, the dates that dead end mains are flushed have to be recorded. Now, collecting chlorine residuals is a process control and best management practice, but it's not something noted in the rule. And then the 5-minute flush, there is nothing in our rules that says how you should flush. You're going to want to find what is the best practice for your system. Okay, Jackie? Yeah.
So for the internal inspection of pressure tanks every 5 years, does that apply to elevated storage tanks?
No, that's going to be only pressure tanks. So if you have an elevated when you have an elevated storage tank, when you do your annual inspections, and this is also for your ground storage tanks, it's an external and internal inspection. So if you're comfortable climbing an elevated storage tank, hey, you have at it. But we mostly see people will contract out for maybe just the elevated, and then they'll do their own interior or their own ground storage tanks. But pressure tanks is the only one that has to be inspected once every 5 years in the interior. Ground storage tanks and elevated storage tanks the interior has to be inspected every year.
If I'm going to replace my meters on the wells, do I have to turn anything into TCEQ before I can do it?
No, not to TCEQ, but do you have a groundwater conservation district?
Yes.
You might want to talk to your groundwater conservation district. Some of the districts are very strict about their meters. And so I have heard some of them would want you to contact them when you're going to replace your meter because so they can come out and tag. But you do not have to notify the TCEQ before you change your meter.
Well, I'm in CNT,
See,
so I own everything.
okay. So yeah, then you don't have to notify TCEQ when you're replacing your meters.
Okay, thank you.
Is there a minimum or maximum size on the inspection port that has to be on the pressure tank?
So that size is going, in our rules, we usually refer to AWWA standards. And so they're probably going to have the minimum and maximum amount of sizes. But I will tell you, I believe if it's less than, pressure tanks that are usually at least 1,500 gallons or more will tend to have a pressure inspection. So if you have a blue bladder tank, those do not need to have an interior pressure tank inspection. But in terms of do I know the minimum and maximum size, it's not built into TCEQ, but it might be in the AWWA standards for pressure tanks. And I believe also the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME requirements. Okay, thank you so much.